With the vegetation as it is right now, it wasn't very large area.
You're only talking 6 or 7.
Well, good evening. My name's not Karen MacNutt. My name is Sarah Mitchell Cutler. And I live in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. And Colonel Summers was kind enough to ask me to come down to speak to a few of his friends here about the American Revolution and what I remember about it, because I was living in Georgetown at the time. Now, that's, let's see, it's 1816 now, so that was about 40 years ago. And I found that a lot of people up my way no longer remember the revolution because they were born too late. I would be willing to bet that if I asked for a show of hands, that very few, if any of you, other than maybe Colonel Summers, would raise their hand if I asked how many here remember the war as opposed to reading about it or hearing about it from somebody. How many actually remember it? Well, you see, Colonel Summers, that's why it was good for you to invite me to speak here today. Now, why would a lady from Massachusetts be willing to come and talk to you about Georgetown, South Carolina? Well, that's because my mother was Marion. No, that's wrong. That's my aunt is Marion. My mother was Esther Marion, and she married first John Alston, and then she married Thomas Mitchell. And she was the sister of General Marion, and my aunt was Mary Esther Marion. Poor Mary Esther died last year, and she was just about the last of her generation. And in fact, most of my generation has passed also. But my mother had 5 brothers. She lived just outside of Georgetown when she was married to Mr. Alston. And then after he passed, she married my father, Thomas Mitchell. And they lived at the Greenwich Plantation, which is right on St. James Street there in Georgetown. And that's where I grew up, and I lived there until about '94, when I married Mr. Cutler, who was a merchant from Roxbury, Massachusetts, and that's how I ended up in the Boston area. But I was in Georgetown during the Revolution, and I remember that time well. It was a very difficult time for us. But let me go back a little bit before that. I don't remember much of what was leading up to the Revolution. I was only about 10 years old when it began. But my mother had, as I said, she had 5 brothers. The oldest was Isaac. He had an inn up on Little River, right on the border between North and South Carolina, and they called it the Boundary House. He was married to Rebecca, who was my aunt, and they had a townhouse up on Haymarket Street. And then I had, the next in line was my Uncle Ben, who had a big plantation out west of Georgetown. And then there was Gabriel and Joe, who had plantations out on the Santee River. They also had a townhouse in Georgetown on Prince Street. And then there was my Uncle Francis, who was the baby of the family. Now, first I really remember and was aware of the Revolution was when a ship came to Uncle Isaac's inn up at Little River. He was a member of that ultra-secret Committee of Correspondence that had been set up by the Sons of Liberty. And when the Battle of Concord and Lexington took place, the Sons of Liberty up in Massachusetts sent out ships all over to tell people what had happened. And the ship for South Carolina went to my Uncle Isaac's inn, and then he sent messengers to Georgetown and to Charlestown to tell them about the King's troops attacking the good citizens. Now, we all thought of ourselves as British, so it wasn't the British troops attacking, it was the King's troops that were attacking. And it was like a bolt of lightning hit Georgetown. Everybody was very excited about this and very upset. And all the gentlemen put on their militia gear, and they went out and they drilled, and they bragged about how no king's army was going to come to Georgetown and take our guns. They couldn't step foot in our town without our permission. And he was kind of funny. Some of the men went out on that point out there at the end of town, and they thought they would build a redoubt, they call it. They threw a mound of dirt. And they found some old cannon that they put out there, and I think if they fired it off, it would have blown up. But they all thought they were doing great stuff. But that was what they did. There was a lot of patriotism going around. And after a while, things kind of quieted down, and not much happened in Georgetown. There were some problems with getting goods. And then word came that the British had evacuated, the British Army had evacuated Boston, and they were going to come to Charleston, South Carolina, and try to attack. So the militia company all drilled, and the men all went off to Charlestown. And the ladies were quite upset about this, but we were very proud of our menfolk, and we wanted them to do the right thing. So they all went off, and big victory. They came home, and there was celebrations, and they were firing off their muskets, and there were banquets and parties, and everybody was congratulating themselves about what a great job we had done in driving off the English fleet. Well, once again, things kind of quieted down, and war was going on up north, but it really didn't seem to affect us much. In '77, it was kind of a bad year for the family. My mother died, and my father had died when I was very young, and the plantation went to my brother, Thomas Mitchell, the Greenwich Plantation. I was living there at the time, and shortly after that, my Uncle Gabe died, and then Uncle Ben, who had been a major in the militia, died, and Uncle Joe died. So there was just Uncle Frank and Uncle Isaac left, so that whole group. And they all decided, all the men folk decided that I should get married and settle down. And they found me a good husband in Dr. Warren, and I thought it was a grand thing to do until they told me I had to give up my dolls, because I was only 14. And I was very naive. And when they said I couldn't play with my dolls anymore, I was absolutely crushed. But as things went on, it was a good marriage, and the doctor, he was 24, I was 14. He was a good man, and we had a good marriage. But after a bit, he went off with the Army, and I didn't see much of him. Uncle Frank was in the Army too. Every so often we would see him, he'd be recruited, and men seemed to trust him. Apparently he had done well in the Indian Wars and had somewhat of a reputation. But again, things quieted down, and the war seemed to be passing us by. But then we heard that the General Clinton, I think it was, had landed in Savannah and captured the city, and they were pushing northward. And it was kind of disturbing because our men didn't seem to be able to hold them back, and a big defeat at Savannah for our men. And the British kept coming further and further north up the coast. And after, I was living on the plantation with my husband. He wasn't there, but it was his plantation. And after a bit, I received a letter from my Uncle Frank, and he had suggested that I should move into town to live at Greenwich again with my brother Tom, because there had been a lot of problems. As the British Army came up the coast, they weren't treating people very nice. They set up what they call foraging parties, and they would go to a plantation and they would pretty much strip everything. They'd take all the cattle and the workforce and whatever else they could take. And there had been instances where ladies had been abused in the most shocking manner. Probably the most infamous example was Lady Cutler. Now here was a woman who was the wife of a peer of the realm, and some soldiers forced their way into her house, and she was cut with a saber, they say, and unspeakable things were done. And so their feeling was that we would be safer in town rather than out on our plantations. And Greenwich, although it was a plantation, was basically in town. We could walk to church from the plantation house. So I moved back into the town and was there for the whole rest of the war, living basically with my brother and his wife Ann, my sister-in-law. I had two other sisters living in town. They were from my mother's first marriage. They had a townhouse on Prince Street, almost just kind of halfway up Broad Street. And they also had come in from their plantations, same basic reason. After a bit, we heard that Charleston had fallen, and it was a shock. Nobody really believed that could happen. This was our capital city, and so many of the men had gone out there to defend it, and still had fallen into the hands of the British. After a bit, we heard about rumors of massacres of Continental soldiers by a British cavalryman by the name of Tarleton. And so this was something very, very troubling to us all. And then one day, let me back up. We had always assumed that Uncle Frank, who was a colonel in the Continental Army, the regular army, he had a regiment in Charlestown, the 2nd Regiment, a very good regiment, by the way, with an excellent reputation. We always assumed that he had been captured in the city, but apparently he hadn't. Colonel Peter O'Ree, lived in town, and when he heard that Charleston had fallen, he put his uniform on and rode through town. It was very embarrassing. This fellow who was drunk, he kind of fell out of one of the taverns, and he started saying nasty things to Colonel O'Ree. Oh, you're going to get yours, and you Continental colonels are all to be hung, and things like that, really nasty things. After the war, I asked Colonel O'Ree why he had put his uniform on and why he had left town. He said, well, he held the Continental Commission, and even although he didn't have a regiment at the time, he was afraid that if the British caught him, they would say he was a spy and hang him and treat him poorly. So that was why he had left. But as I started to say, after a bit, Colonel Tarleton himself came into town. A long string of troopers with him. Good-looking man. They said he was a ladies' man, and you could understand why. He was really rather striking-looking gentleman. But he was very good to everybody in the city, and we had no problems with him. But he had this list of names of people he was looking for, and one of them was Peter O'Ree, and another was my Uncle Frank. And that was the first time that we knew that Uncle Frank had not been captured in Charlestown, which made us all kind of happy. Later after the war, I asked him, how come you weren't captured? Why weren't you with your regiment? And he explained to us that there had been a party, and he had been invited, and after the host thought it would be a funny thing to do to make sure everybody was falling down drunk. And so he locked the doors. Now, I had never in my life seen my Uncle Frank drunk. Now, he drank, sure. He had a glass of brandy from time to time, but he was not one to be falling down drunk. So apparently he had some words with the host, and they weren't going to let him out. He didn't want to make a scene. So apparently he left by means of a window, and he said he fell rather badly and broke his ankle. And so they sent him home. And that's why he wasn't in the city when it fell. All his life, that ankle bothered him from time to time. You'd see him, he'd be a little bad weather, cold weather, and it would bother him. In fact, I don't think I ever saw him later like wear a boot. He always wore like low shoes and gaiters, because I think that ankle bothered him. But after Tarleton went through the city, not the town, it was not a city, the town, some time passed, and then a British warship came in, a little tiny, not a big ship, but a little one. And there's Captain Ardenoff or Ardsenoff or something. He was very obnoxious, whatever his name was. And when he arrived, he said all the ships in the harbor were war prizes. So he took every ship he could lay his hands on, all the fishing boats and the little merchantmen, and he took them as prizes of war, and they were sold on, and he pocketed the money. It was just thief was all he was. And then he sent boats up the rivers to seize as much as he could from the plantations, again saying that was war booty, and of course that money went into his pocket also. So people didn't particularly like him, but he was there to garrison the town. And they took that big inn at the bottom of Broad Street on Front Street. They made that their headquarters. And he took the finest house on Broad Street, actually almost opposite my sister's townhouse, as his command headquarters. And they took over the church and they made that into their stable. And then off Scrivener Street, they took people's homes and they would come, they'd knock on your house, and they'd say, we're going to quarter troops. Now, when we passed our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, the Third Amendment, the Third Bill of Rights, said you can't quarter troops. Now, I bet most of you don't even know what that means. They would come along and they would say, okay, you have a kitchen, that's good. You have a dining room, that's good. How many other rooms you have? And they would put 4 to 6 soldiers in each of those other rooms. And you were expected to feed them. And they weren't going to pay you. And they would literally eat you out of house and home. But that's how they took care of the troops. So let's see, all those houses up along Scrivener Street, they used, and then they came around and they took the jail and the courthouse, and they made that into their fort. They dug a trench around it, and then they put these little sticks with points on them. What do they call them? Some of you military men might know. What are those pointy sticks they used for the
abatis.
That's it, yeah. That abatis, is that what you call it, Colonel? So they did that, and then they came around, and then on High Market Street, right there, near Orange, they put their hospital. And that was right next to Uncle Isaac's house, which was going to cause some problems a little later. But that's what they were doing. Well, everything was not so good. You had these arrogant people walking around town, treating you like dirt, basically. And we were not liberated. We were occupied. That was clear. My brothers, much to my shame, and a lot of the other gentlemen, much to the shame of many of the ladies of the town, fell all over themselves to go to the British Commandant and say, oh, we're good, loyal British subjects, we just wanted tax reform, and now that you've promised tax reform, we're going to be good little British subjects and give you no problems, and on and on and on. And that was absolutely disgusting. But they got theirs, because no sooner had they done that than the authorities said, okay, we accept that you're good little British subjects. And like good little British subjects, you'll all flock to the army and serve in the King's army and go fight for us. Well, that's not what they had in mind, believe me. Not too many people were happy about that. One morning, I got up and Ann got up and Tom wasn't there, my brother Tom, and he left a note saying he was going up country to work on one of his other plantations, and he just never came back. And he actually eventually joined with my Uncle Frank. It's kind of hard to explain the roller coaster, the ups and downs we had of emotions. We heard that General Gates was coming to take over the American Army. Now, Gates had been the hero at Saratoga, and so great things were expected of him. But it didn't last long because he was very badly defeated. And at that point, we thought that the war certainly was over for us. One American force after another was defeated, but then Uncle Frank started attacking British troops. The first group he attacked were convoying American prisoners, and he did that one after another. And the British didn't like that at all, obviously. And they would send out patrols after him. But as many times as they came back and said that they had driven him off, he would come back and he would raid some more. And then one day Isaac showed up in town, and he said that the British had come up to Little River and seized his inn, and they told him if he valued his health, he would go to Georgetown. So he had come to Georgetown, and he was living in the townhouse next to the hospital. It was after one of Uncle Frank's raids that a bunch of soldiers broke into his house and grabbed him. They had a punishment that they called riding the horse. And that was, they'd take a plank and be on its edge, and they would take some soldier who had been drunk or had been disobedient, and they would put him on this plank as a punishment. And so they arrived at Uncle Isaac's house, and they grabbed him and they put him on this plank. It was painted red like the horse that Uncle Frank was riding, and they put Isaac on that plank and they ran him around town. And they kept saying, "Where's your brother? Where's this Mr. Marion?" Because they would not give Uncle Frank a title. He was Mr. Marion. And of course Isaac didn't know. And finally Isaac said to them, now Isaac was a big man, big fist, big man, and a brawler, quite frankly. People were physically afraid of Isaac. And he couldn't do anything because, of course, he was surrounded by soldiers. He just had to take it. And he wasn't used to that. So finally Isaac says to them, "I don't know where my brother is, but I'm sure you'll hear from him soon enough." Well, they didn't like that answer, so they eventually put Isaac down. Now, this was very scandalizing to the whole town, because Isaac was the justice of the peace. He held the king's commission. He was the judge for the town, and to have the soldiers treat him like that was shocking. Well, it wasn't too long after that I was walking with my sister Ellie downtown, and all of a sudden we heard this awful whooping and hollering and yelling and shouting, and shots being fired. It sounded like a bunch of wild Indians. And come to think that there were a few wild Indians in the group. And it was Uncle Frank with a group of horsemen, and they were riding through the town, while all those British soldiers scampered like rabbits to their little fort, and they barricaded themselves into it. And Uncle Frank, I remember, of course, we're all trying not to smile, because we thought that was kind of funny. He's outside the fort saying, "Come on out! I thought you wanted to talk to me. Come on out!" And they say, "No, we won't come out." And in the meantime, he had some soldiers go, and they went to the church, and they took all the horses that were in the church. They took the saddles and the bridles, and they had some pack horses, and they took whatever they could get on those horses. And after taunting the British for a while, who wouldn't come out of their fort, they left. That was, I think, in October. That didn't make the British occupiers any happier, but there wasn't much they could do about it because they couldn't catch him, they couldn't drive him off. He showed up again in November, and unfortunately at that time he had like little groups of what do you call those? Little scouting troops, anyway, that were on the two highways coming into town. And my cousin Gabriel was in one of them, and him and the local schoolmaster who had been with the general were captured. And the schoolmaster was beaten to death, and the poor Gabriel, when he announced his name, they put a shotgun right to his chest, and they murdered him on the spot. Gabriel was a nice gentleman, and much lamented by everybody when we heard what had happened. After that, the general apparently took my other two cousins of military age, Robert, who eventually became Congressman Robert Marion, we were all very proud of, and Teddy Theodore Samuel Marion, who was Joe's nephew. And he got them up to the University of Pennsylvania, where they spent the rest of the war in safety. But that was the second time the general tried to take the town. Things were never too good. We would go to Charlestown, and we would buy cloth for, we'd say we'd go for aprons or for petticoats or something like that. And then we would go out in the country, and we would visit relatives supposedly at other plantations. And we'd give them the cloth, and the cloth would go to my uncle, to General Marion, and they'd tear it up for patches for bullets or for bandages. And we also would try to get any lead we could get our hands on, or even old pewter. We would collect pewter and toy soldiers, lead flashing from houses that weren't being used, boats that had been abandoned, wherever we could get it. And we would get that in a boat, in a canoe, and at night it would go upriver, and we'd try to get that to General Marion for bullets. We had standing order from my brother, basically, Tom, that if we heard anything at night, we're not to leave the house. And every night we were supposed to keep the dogs and the geese locked up. And I think that's because they were running messengers and spies up and down the river, and they didn't want to be caught. Well, one night we heard in the middle of the night some firing in the town, and we stayed in the house because we didn't want to get in anybody's way. But very curious, he was laying on the ground, right down on the floor. It was kind of scary because we didn't know what was going on. And in the morning when we went out, it was all quiet, like nothing at all had happened. But apparently, my uncle and Colonel Lee had raided the town, and they had captured the commandant. And when we looked out our plantation, we could see where they had landed at our landing right there at Greenwich, and they'd come up over the lawn and over the dikes, because you could see where the grass and everything was trampled down. But they came and went, and all we heard was the firing at night, and that really kind of shook up the garrison there, because all the officers were either captured or killed. Major Irvin was killed of the British command, and the commander, I think at the time was Campbell, was captured. And so that was, I think, the third time that my uncle paid a visit to Georgetown. And then the last time he came, he arrived in front of the town, and they started with picks and shovels, and they were clearly there to stay. And they started their trenches, and in the middle of the night, the fire bells rang, and apparently the church had been set on fire. St. Prince George Church had been set on fire. And we were able to put the fire out, but in the morning, the British were all gone, and Uncle Frank and his men came into town, and what a joyous thing. People were hugging and kissing the soldiers and giving them bottles of wine, and a big celebration. Everybody was very happy. And the first thing I think Uncle Frank did is he went to see his brother Isaac, but Isaac wasn't doing well. After one of the parties that had gone after my Uncle Frank had come back defeated, I think it may have even been Colonel Watson, the soldiers with wagon loads, they had wagon loads of wounded soldiers that they brought to that hospital right next to Uncle Isaac's house. Some of the soldiers that weren't wounded broke into the house, and they roughed up Isaac, and they smashed the house up pretty good. And they ran a bayonet through poor Rebecca's mother's portrait was there on the wall. It was vicious. And they were there for a while, and an officer came along and stopped it. But Isaac never recovered from that. And about 2 days after Uncle Frank took the town, we were liberated, Isaac died. And so he was buried there in the churchyard. And we didn't have a minister because the minister had been of loyal sentiment and had been driven out and left with the British troops. But I think just about everybody in town came to the interment. And it was kind of a bittersweet thing. The American troops, Marion's brigade stayed there for a while, and they left. After about 2 weeks, I think, maybe they left, and Uncle Frank came in looking like a rag. He had a uniform on he probably had on for almost a year. And when he left, he had a whole brand new suit of clothes and all sorts of nice fancy tent and everything. So he was well equipped at that point. He looking very proper as a general. And we were all happy to see that happen. But about maybe 2 or 3 weeks after, a privateer came in to the harbor. There was a loyalist privateer, and they fired on the town. And a whole, I'd say, maybe 40, 50 buildings caught on fire and burned. So the end of the occupation left the town pretty much in a deplorable state. Anything that was valuable and movable had been removed by the troops that were leaving, and church had been burned, and many of the buildings had been burnt by the privateers. So it was bittersweet, but people were still happy to see the British gone. And they hadn't been gone long when commerce returned, and we started getting a lot of ships coming in from the north and from other areas, and so we were a very busy port for a while. All that material was sent up the Black River because they thought it could not be protected in Georgetown. But that's pretty much my memory of the war. As I say, it was not a happy time. Things were tough. It's hard to imagine living under a situation where you had no rights at all, and anybody could come into your house and take whatever they wanted. And that's something I hope never happens to us again. And that's why it's important to value the sacrifice of the men who served. So if anyone has any questions, I understand that Mrs. Summers has arranged some refreshments, but I can answer a few questions if anyone has any. Thank you very much. I thought this was really an amazing contraption. We don't have things like this up my way, so I'll have to get Colonel Summers to tell us how to get a wonderful megaphone. Any questions? Any questions at all? Down there.
What kind of seafood do you like?
What kind of seafood do I like? Well, I used to favor shrimp, but now that I'm in the Boston area, I think I favor lobster. I don't care much for salt cod. You have to soak it to get all the salt out of it. I have some good recipes for it, though, if you want. I'll talk to you about that later. Yes, over here.
Could you describe physically what your Uncle Frank looked like, please?
Certainly. I would guess that he was, first of all, let me tell you, none of the family liked that piece of trash written by Weems. And my Aunt Mary Esther always said if she ever caught that man, she would horsewhip him. Uncle Frank was not ugly, number one. I would guess he was probably about 5'3", with dark hair, very dark, piercing eyes. You could not lie to that man. He could see right through you into your soul, and you knew that. So I've been told by his soldiers that they would rather be lashed than to have a dressing down by the general. Very straight in his posture, very slim and wiry, not an extra pound of flesh on him. Very French looking in his face. He had some knock kneed a little bit, but you know, in today's styles with long pants, you never would have noticed it. But the bridges and the stockings that they were wearing during the time of the Revolution were very unflattering to a lot of people. So that he had a typical French nose, you know, and not a big long beak, mind you, but kind of a hook. He had a very strange sense of humor, very, very dry, and he would he had a way of just, you couldn't rattle him, you know, and you never knew when he was pulling your leg, telling you a story, or he really meant what he was saying. We had formed a plot after the war to get him married off to Aunt Mary Esther, because we thought it was kind of horrible that the two of them were both alone, because all of his family was dead and all of her family was dead. And we kind of tricked her into, Teddy was getting married Theodore had come back, he was getting married. And so we were all together, and the boys said, well, they'll work on Uncle Frank, and the girls are going to work on Mary Esther. One thing with my Aunt Mary Esther, you couldn't say anything bad about the general, that she wouldn't come to his defense. So I think which one of us wasn't me, said, oh, you know, it's terrible, he's up there all by himself, this war hero. And I think it was Ellie said, oh, nobody would marry that old bachelor. I can't imagine anyone being willing to live with him. And immediately Mary Esther said, he's a wonderful man. Any woman would be proud to marry. I'd marry him myself if he'd only asked. Well, you know, that got back to the gentleman, and after a while, the general showed up looking kind of contrite, and all the ladies left the room and left the two of them alone. And after a bit, the two of them, well, we didn't go very far. If we could have stood by the keyhole, we would have. We had to stand back a little further than that. And after a while, the two of them came out. He had a black look on his face. And he looked at all of us with that stare that he had. And he said, Mary Esther and I have been talking, and we've come to the conclusion that there's a conspiracy abroad. And it's none of your business what we do. And oh, we were all crestfallen. The last thing we wanted to do was hurt any of them. And he said, well, this has to stop. You can't keep doing this. And we've determined that the only way we can stop this is to get married. And it was like, wait, what did you say? And he said it with such a straight face. We didn't know that he was just kind of leading us along. And he turned to Teddy and he said, not Teddy, Mr. Marion, he said, would you mind a double wedding? And of course, the wedding was only a couple of weeks off, and we were just dumbfounded. But we had a double wedding. Teddy and Charlotte Ashby got married at Walnut Grove, and then they all got in their cars. We went over to Pont Bluff, and the general and Mary Esther got married at Pont Bluff, and then we had a big reception. It was very nice. They were a very, very sweet and dedicated couple. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to run on like that. Good on you, cousin, good on you.
How many brothers and sisters do you have?
How many brothers and sisters did I have? 15. There's 15 of us all together. But but they're all dead now. I'm the only one left. My two sisters, Ellie and Martha, from Mr. Alston, they were my half-sisters, they lived to maturity. The others did not. And then Tom and Edward lived to maturity, but they're gone now also. So it was a big family, but many of us died young. I'm the only one who's lived to a healthy age. I guess it must be that good New England living. Thank you very much.